of Eswatini on Friday announced Cleopas Dlamini as the new Prime Minister following the passing of Ambrosius Dlamini, who succumbed to COVID-19 complications in December last year. This announcement comes in the wake of weeks of pro-democracy demonstrations. And joining me now on the line from Eswatini is independent journalist Xavier Kakama. Good morning, Xavier, and welcome to Good Morning Namibia.
Good morning, Denver. Good morning, Namibia.
Tell us about the newly appointed Prime Minister for the kingdom.
There's very little known about Cleopas Dlamini other than the fact that he is the former CEO of the Public Service Pension Fund. And one of the key things that the king mentioned during the announcement of his appointment was the fact that he'd done very well as the CEO of the pension fund. And basically this is the narrative we normally get, especially when people have been appointed to the position of prime minister, because oftentimes the only clear qualification is the fact that they are a Dlamini. And then, of course, they're having served at some public enterprise and have been successful. But politically, you find that oftentimes there's very little that you can, pick from to say that this is who he is and this is what we can expect for him to do for the country.
Now, what we know from the outside is that the announcement was preempted by another show of demonstrations. What exactly unfolded on Friday?
Luckily enough, I was covering the march that was supposed to have happened in Manzini on Friday last week at pretty much the same time as the King's address, because originally the announcement was that there'd be a protest march, and it was more a memorial march for the lives lost since the protest started. But that march was dispersed by the police, and some of the information that I gathered when I interviewed witnesses who were present and weren't necessarily taking part in the protests themselves, is that the riots, or rather the protests, were dispersed by the police after one of the protesters blew a whistle. And apparently he was beat up and shots were fired, and then the crowds were dispersed, and pretty much the whole city of Manzini was emptied. And a lot of the people that had been taking part in the protests were saying that they are somehow being forced to attend Sibaya, which the king had called for pretty much at the same time. Both were supposed to start at 10 a.m. on Friday.
Now, with the latest appointment, we also saw that the king finally broke his silence since the demonstrations began last month. What is your take on his stance?
Honestly speaking, I think it's clear for everyone to see, and pretty much everyone is saying the same thing, especially when you talk to civic organizations, the public, as well as the organizations that are part of the call for a transition in the country in terms of the political dispensation, is that basically the king told everyone that this is how things are done in Eswatini, and this is how he'll continue doing them, which basically says this is, to a certain extent, a disregard of some of the calls that have been made by those calling for change. Because one of the things that was explicitly stated was that people want the ability to appoint their own prime minister. So him doing that while people are calling for the other is him basically, by and large, saying, this is how I do things here, and this is how things will be done. And, of course, he did say that people will be invited to another Sibaya where they can express themselves and let him know what it is that they feel. But right now, the decision says this is Swaziland, or this is Eswatini, and we do things this way.
Against the backdrop of the king's sentiments on that, what do you make of the prospects of a transition?
I can't really say, and this is what's confusing a lot of people right now, because all of us are anxiety-stricken based on what happened on Friday, looking at what people have been calling for the past 3 weeks. You just find yourself in a state where you are like, what happens next? Because the responses from the political parties, one of which is Prodemocracy, proscribed political party, was that, this fight needs to be carried forward. And you wonder what it is that they mean by this fight needs to be carried forward. They had a meeting this past weekend, a coalition of pro-democracy organizations, which includes the prescribed parties, the civic organizations operating in the country, the business community, all condemned the King's address at Sibaya this past weekend. And you would get the sense that they are also, rallying one another for the next response. The question is, what is that response? And looking at what's happened, towards the end of June, what the Swazis are obviously worried.
At regional level, there's been one intervention that has given rise to some level of hope. Now, since the SADC Troika assembled in Eswatini, have there been any further developments in that particular respect?
There have been further developments in the sense that originally the Troika delegation came into the country, and they met a few individuals who a lot of people have said are somewhat aligned with the government. Therefore, it wasn't, an open dialogue that involved all stakeholders. So they've come back now and are having conversations with some of the other entities, including the Prodemocracy MPs, as well as some of the other organizations, which would include civic organizations. So at the moment, we haven't yet gotten a clear sense of what direction Troika is taking this, what direction government is taking this, or the monarch itself, and what direction those calling for change are taking things. Like I've been saying throughout this conversation, it's just a confusion because, in Eswatini, you find that information filters out very slowly. It's very controlled. And you find oftentimes many speculations are made while these little bits of information filter through.
What does the picture on the ground look like in as far as it relates to basic supplies and commodities?
The situation has kind of normalized. The question is how long. But some of the things that we had difficulty securing once the riot had started was more your basic necessities. Bread was hard to get, shops were closed, but shops are opened now, and the government statement that was issued after the King's Sibaya was to the effect that the curfew would be extended from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. And would last until 4 p.m. the next day instead of 5 p.m. the next day as was originally stated. So what they're basically saying in essence is that shops can now operate normal hours because lots of businesses were shutting down at 3:30. We didn't have fuel because, there were issues with the transportation bringing the fuel into the country, with many speculating that these belong to royalty or the king to a certain extent. And of course, some of the protesters have threatened that those would be set alight or would be somewhat hindered from continuing with the process of delivering fuel. But that has since normalized. Some of the papers or media this side has reported that we will have a period of normalcy in terms of fuel supply. But generally everything's kind of back to normal.
Now, bearing the prevailing uncertainty in mind, many citizens have sought refuge in neighboring South Africa. Is that still the case?
I'm not really sure about the reports that have been circulating, outside of Eswatini to the effect that many Eswatini were now seeking refuge in South Africa because of the political turmoil happening in the country. I think, honestly speaking, those are reports, maybe speculations that people are now having based on what's happening. But there hasn't been that much of a situation where people are saying they want to get out of the country as quickly as possible. Of course, maybe people might be planning to do that because of what they see. But honestly speaking, I wouldn't say that's the case at the moment.
Bearing the size, magnitude and frequency of these pro-democracy protests in mind, to what extent could they add fuel to the COVID-19 fire in Eswatini?
This is one of the things that government has been using to defend the abolishment or the banning of delivery of petitions or even mass protests, because of course we are experiencing the inward trends towards becoming a country that's being affected by the third wave, as most countries in Southern Africa are. And, one wonders whether that can be used long enough when you look at the way the political parties or those that are calling for change are saying this should be done now, which now puts the country in a catch-22 situation because COVID is real, while at the same time, the demands that people have are real, and for many they are legitimate. And many feel that this is the time at which things need to be done for the change to be implemented and effected. So it's just one of those things where you can't really see a way forward here. Things will just unfold as they do.
Xavier, before we let you go, what are your concluding remarks this morning, please?
I think one would ask that the rest of the world as well as Eswatini pray for the kingdom, because we are a peaceful country naturally and we are not familiar with this kind of mode of operation on either side. And, the people in the middle of this are the ones that are suffering. If you look at the damage that's been done to property, most of it is in the locations, most of it is in the townships where the people are already suffering because of the hardships that they experience as far as access to opportunities and employment. So, yes, just to ask that people do pray for the country.
Thank you very much and best of luck.
Thank you very much.
That was Xavier Kakama, independent journalist in Eswatini, talking to us about threats to the kingdom. When we come back,